Hello again. Whenever I ask here what benefits accrued to Britain from immigration from the Caribbean, somebody is sure to raise the subject of the nurses who came to this country from the West Indies during the 1950s and 1960s. The claim is explicitly made that they somehow saved the National Health Service, and that their coming here was a selfless act answering a call for help from the mother country, as it is put. This is, of course, wholly untrue, but it would be a rash person who said so out loud. Enoch Powell was invariably brought into the conversation. It's even claimed that he recruited nurses from the Caribbean himself. In a description to this video, I give a link to a programme made by the BBC a few years ago to mark the 70th anniversary of the founding of the National Health Service. It is called Black Nurses, the Women who Saved the NHS, and it sets out to show that without black nurses, the National Health Service would have been unable to survive in its early years. The only problem is that although there are many anecdotes from women who came to this country from Jamaica to train as nurses in the 1950s, and also a good deal about the racism which was widespread in Britain at that time, this documentary gives no facts and figures to prove the assertion in the title that these women saved the NHS. It relies instead on bare assertion, which is seldom good grounds for believing anything to be true. We might turn instead to a more reliable source in the BBC, which would not be hard, and see what Nursing Times has to say about the matter in a piece published 2 years ago entitled A History of Nursing in Britain, 1950s. I give a link to this too in the description to this video. We read, the 1950s were dominated by the profession, government and employers trying to establish what the norm would be for nursing, and it began with a theme that would feature in every decade after the 1950s, nurse shortages. Many hospitals experienced such shortages. On top of the 150,000 strong nurse workforce in the UK, estimates were made that another 48,000 nurses were needed. Incidentally, this is perfectly true, of course, that there was a shortage of nurses in the 1950s. It was Irish people who made up the bulk of the recruits that were used to plug those gaps. You probably won't hear much about the contribution of Ireland when the 75th anniversary of the NHS is being celebrated. But there it is. There were a good deal more Irish nurses than there were ones from the West Indies. In the 1950s, there were 150,000 nurses in the United Kingdom, and more nurses were needed. This is absolutely true. The number of nurses rose until there were perhaps 250,000 by the late 1960s. How many of these nurses were from the Caribbean? In other words, what was the actual proportion of nurses from the West Indies at that time, the women who had saved the NHS? Most of these nurses were from Jamaica, and in 1965 there were fewer than 5,000 of them in the whole country. That represents 2% of the total number of nurses in the United Kingdom. This percentage was much lower in the 1950s, probably half that. In other words, in the 1950s, something like 99% of nurses were not from the Caribbean. They were a very minor part of the workforce. The idea that 1% of the nurses in the country somehow saved the NHS is pretty grotesque. As I said, far more Irish women were recruited than Caribbeans, but you won't be seeing a headline anytime soon which claims that Irish women saved the NHS, although their contribution was immeasurably greater than that of Caribbeans. This myth about the West Indies and the NHS is now so well established that it will probably never be challenged in the future.